My name is Ethan Borg and I am the EMtuitive, and I'm going to tell you my story. It starts with being an athlete in high school and being just about to go off to college. I was very excited to go off to college, and I was very much at peak of my life, feeling wonderful, when I suddenly probably got a tick bite and suddenly got very, very ill. And the illness persisted for 7 years. And when I went off to college, I was pre-med. I was planning on being a doctor like my dad. But in the process of dealing with this illness, I saw doctor after doctor who just could not provide the relief I needed. And so this chronic fatigue persisted and persisted. Eventually I decided I was not going to be a doctor. I decided I would be a writer instead. And I started writing fiction, but at the same time I realized I needed a way to support myself. So I wrote copy for businesses. This was in 1994, and Netscape just suddenly came out, and everyone suddenly needed a website. And I found myself not just writing copy, I was now writing HTML. And the next thing I knew, and by the way, that's the language for the World Wide Web. And next thing I knew, I was writing JavaScript, Visual Basic, Java, and I found myself suddenly a programmer. And I moved to the West Coast. This was during the dot-com boom. Everything was very exciting about the internet at that time. And in the interim, I discovered that there was another medicine on this planet, one that had been around for at least 3,000 years, called Chinese medicine. And I tiptoed into it because being from a Western mindset, I was not immediately excited by the idea of putting needles in my body. But it changed my life. It really significantly improved my situation after very little other things did. And eventually I looked around and I saw all these other programmers around me who were very passionate about what they were doing. And I realized that my passion was still in being a healer, and not in being a programmer. But the important point is that I became a programmer, and I learned how to think like a programmer. So ultimately I decided, okay, I'm going to go into Chinese medicine. And I went to the oldest school of acupuncture in this country, the New England School of Acupuncture. And that school had 2 tracks. Everyone learned Chinese acupuncture styles, but you would either learn Japanese acupuncture style or Chinese herbal medicine. And I decided that I was so passionate about it that I wanted to do both. And so it took thousands of extra hours, but I became a practitioner of both Japanese and Chinese and even some Korean acupuncture techniques. And I became a practitioner of Chinese herbal medicine. And when my school was over, I was still feeling the need to learn more. So I fortunately won a fellowship to study the classics of Chinese medicine and spent a year reading and writing about the classics of Chinese medicine. And I was really astonished to discover that the classics look at Chinese medicine from the lens of energy medicine, which is not what I had expected. And given that I started off from a very Western perspective, it was a big change in perspective for me to start to look at what I was doing from an energy first perspective. And but I took on the motto that I'll do what works, because ultimately that's what mattered most, is that my patients got better. And I started out my practice, and I was practicing in Frederick, Maryland. And I just happened to overlap in an office space temporarily with this woman named Karen Custer, who I felt energy coming off of her in waves, like voom, voom. And I've never felt that before, and I've never felt it since. And she told me that she was a therapist, but she did a lot of energy work and kind of a spiritual level of therapy. And even though I had spent all these extra hours in school and had vowed I would never take another class, she told me she taught classes, and I said, whatever you teach, I'm taking. And I did. And it was during one of these classes that she was talking about long distance healing, and she was talking about how you could learn skills from other people and take on their skill set. When during one of these classes I had an epiphany. And the epiphany was basically how I could use programming, this method of thinking, and apply it to classical Chinese medicine. So even though Karen taught about energy modalities that I never practiced before or never practiced since, it was in one of those classes that I realized how I could do the medicine that I had learned better. And what resulted from that was the beginning of what's now known as Eminus Mirus. And those of us who practice it, we shorten that down and abbreviate it to sound just like the letter M. But Eminus Mirus is a technique that's based on classical Chinese medicine, these ideas of five-element theory, qi, yin and yang, what balance is, what imbalance means in the body, and how that generates symptoms of disease. And I realized I could combine that with feng shui, which is basically traditional physics. It's not that you put something in the room and you're suddenly rich, which is how we like to think about it now in the Western world. But really, it's a classical way of thinking about how energy flows in space. And when you take that feng shui and apply it to the body, you get this idea of lines of energy going through the body in every possible direction. These lines of energy turn out to be very important. They have a fingerprint of the five elements that's unique, each one of these lines, and each line resonates with the tissue of the body. And if you can manipulate the energy, you manipulate that tissue. And that became two big pillars of this idea of Eminus Mirus. And the last pillar was modern ideas of anatomy and physiology. That in Chinese medicine, there is no concept of glands or nerves per se, but we could take these ideas from the Western world and start to combine that with classical theory to understand nerves better and hormones better and how to manipulate them and balance them better. And over the course of many years, I honed Eminus Mirus. It had many different shapes and flavors, and each time I'd come out with it and would discover that it wasn't, the tool set was still too confusing. So I honed it and I honed it and I honed it over the course of well over a decade to a point where it is accessible to anybody. And when my child was 6 years old, I taught her how to use it, and she was able to use it. The very first level, the basic level, that's free to learn. And so that is what I have been doing. I've been teaching people, and of course I'm a practitioner of this energy modality. And it's very exciting, and I'm happy to be sharing it with you today.